What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week, episode 46, we're doing something similar to what I did a few weeks ago, and which I'm pretty sure I mentioned in that video, that review having been of the Iliad by Homer. This week, we're covering the Odyssey, and just as I explained in the Iliad review, the reason that I'm covering these two books on the Book Binge instead of waiting to do them on Count the Classics or giving them more of a scripted treatment rather than just a normal review, because I haven't done a normal review of any of the classics that I've really read outside of these two. It's because I feel like these two are a little bit different than how we tend to think of classics in this day and age. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the oldest books that I have read, and while some aspects of them feel like it, they also feel very modern, which may in no small part be due to the translation, but the stories are timeless, especially in this one being the Odyssey, which we will cover in a little bit more detail here in a second. Now, having finished the Odyssey compared to having not finished it when I actually recorded my review of the Iliad, I do feel justified in making individual reviews for the two of them instead of covering them both together, because they're two very different stories, again, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail a little bit later. The Odyssey, I think, is sometimes, or maybe even frequently, viewed as a sequel of sorts to the Iliad, and in some essence or in some sense, you could say that that may be accurate or true, but in a lot of ways, it's really not. Although, with that being said, it is legitimately just as good, just as high quality as the Iliad is, just in a very different way, relatively speaking. So let's actually talk about how that is the case and begin with what are the best elements of the Odyssey. Now, unlike the Iliad, in certain ways, I feel like the Odyssey is more like a book the way that we think of it today than the Iliad was. It's more of a traditional narrative. This was something that I explained in the Iliad review, being one of the things that might be the most jarring, I suppose, for a modern reader getting into it, is that it doesn't have a plot in the way that readers would expect it to. The story that it follows is not nearly as narratively paced in a way that we as modern readers are in any way used to. The Iliad doesn't really have a problem that the plot of the story is trying to solve per se. It has a story, but it's not a plot is kind of the best way that I can think to explain it without getting too technical. Conversely, the Odyssey actually begins with a problem that the whole epic spends time trying to resolve from beginning to end. That problem obviously being, if you haven't read this book, it's not really a spoiler. The problem being resolved is that of Odysseus needing to come home after the Battle of Troy, which didn't actually occur in the Iliad, as I said in that review as well. Now, many well-known tales and myths in Greek mythology actually come from the Odyssey. Again, you could say this is kind of spoilery in a sense, but at the same time, it's really old, and the chances that you, as being a reader interested in reading potentially being interested in reading the Odyssey haven't heard of some of these myths is really low. So stuff like Polyphemus the Cyclops with the "nobody blinded me" bit that Odysseus caused, Circe's Island turning the crew into swine, and some others that I won't take the time to mention because there's a lot of classic, well-known, and iconic myths and legends of Odysseus's tale in here, and it's all really good. Something as well that I also really appreciate about the Odyssey was just the way that it was paced. The first few books of it are spent in one location doing one thing, and that's just a few books, and then the next several books are spent in with other characters doing another thing. And they're kind of like two acts in a sense, but then the whole back half, like I think it's books 12 through 24, it might be books 13 through 24, it's somewhere around the halfway point that the tale actually shifts from Odysseus being pretty much at home and planning the revenge on the suitors, and that's as deep into the details of that as I will go into. The fact that the poet of the Odyssey which whether it was Homer, whether it was the same Homer as the Iliad, we don't know, but whether the way that the author of the Odyssey was able to write essentially the back half of this poem and make it as exciting and really as enjoyable to get throughout the entire thing as it is for the entirety of those last 12 books, despite it being really limited in scope and in purpose, compared especially to the first several books, which go by in a surprisingly small amount of time, which you'll see if you read it. It was just fantastic, and the ending especially, very brutal. Like, everything about the last few books was just chef's kiss. I really enjoyed my time with that. I was just enraptured my entire way through the Odyssey. And with all that being said, let's get into, as usual, what are the worst elements of the Odyssey in comparison. I think for me, probably the worst part of the Odyssey, was just the fact that I don't think I was blown away with it as much as I was blown away with the Iliad. And a lot of that comes with my familiarity with the Odyssey. The fact that I already knew most of the stories that Odysseus tells in the Odyssey, most of the myths and legends that people are very familiar with, the fact that I was already familiar with that myself, and also familiar with the Odyssey as an entire epic because I read a graphic novel version of it many years ago that really enjoyed it. It actually covers a surprisingly large amount of the poem. The fact that I was so familiar with the Odyssey meant that I wasn't as blown away or as surprised by its quality as I was with the Iliad, relatively speaking, even though it was definitely, without a doubt, easily just the same quality, which I said earlier. I go back and forth, actually, between which one I think is better, whether I prefer the Odyssey and whether I prefer the Iliad. Sorry, I motioned my hands incorrectly there, but that doesn't matter. They're just so different from one another. The Iliad is a tale of war. Pretty much every book, nearly every book of the 24 books in the Iliad are war, battle sequences. And that's the point of the book, essentially, is going through this with specific characters and what some characters decide to do as a result of actions of other characters. That's what the Iliad is doing. The Odyssey is, like I've said a few times up to this point, much more of a narrative. It is about a character trying to get home from the war who has not been home in a long time and what he does after he does get home. That's what the Odyssey is about. I think for storytelling purposes, as a story, I think I prefer the Odyssey, and I think the Odyssey is probably better. But as just, something that just blew my socks off and something that I just really enjoyed and was surprised by, the Iliad takes the cake for that. But they're both as worthy as the others. And as you'll notice in this section, I didn't actually say anything that I thought was really bad about the Odyssey. Compared to the Iliad, where there's elements like the things that you expect to happen in the Iliad, or the things that pop culture knows the Iliad as being, aren't actually in there, and it's not really that much of a traditional narrative, that makes it a little bit less approachable, even though it's a lot more approachable than you think it is. In comparison, the Odyssey is probably the easier of the two books. If you are intimidated by these two, I would say that you don't need to be, because they're a lot easier than I think a lot of people expect them to be. But the Odyssey is even easier than the Iliad. So if you have read the Iliad and you enjoyed that, there's no chance that you won't also enjoy reading the Odyssey. Or if you're a little bit more intimidated by the Iliad because it's bigger, because it's not really much of a traditional narrative, or if you're familiar with a lot of Greek hero myths, especially those regarding Odysseus, and you want to read the source material, I heavily recommend checking out The Odyssey by Homer, because the source material is every bit as good as I was hoping it would be, especially after having read the Iliad. Both of them are phenomenal. As such, I think general audiences might actually connect and enjoy the Odyssey a little bit more than its predecessor, but I think they're still both very worthy of reading, and that you should obviously check out both of them, just as I think this entire review has made very clear. I highly recommend you checking them out for yourself, and if you don't take my word for it, take the word of almost anybody else who has read these as well. They're very, very good. And if you're love Greek history and mythology like me, there's no reason why you should not read them. And with that being said, thank you for watching this review. I know it was a little bit of a shorter one. I wanted it to be a little bit shorter after several of my most recent videos being a lot longer than I anticipated and wanted them being. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope you got something out of it. If you've read the Iliad and haven't read the Odyssey yet, I hope you've made the decision that maybe you should check out the Odyssey at some point pretty soon or whenever you have the time. Thank you for watching the video. I'll be back next week with, I think it's my review of American Psycho. Don't quote me on that because I might be remembering incorrectly. But if it is a review of American Psycho, that was quite the review. I recommend you check that out when it comes out next week. Thank you guys again for watching. I'll be back again in the next episode of the Book Binge.